So wait, a general makes a sensible tactical retreat to save his forces from being wiped out, and Hitler throws him in jail. I mean, does that moment reveal more about Hitler's psychological detachment from reality than almost any other order?
It absolutely does. The decision was completely irrational, and it sent this clear, chilling signal down the command chain. Attempting a tactical withdrawal, however sensible or necessary, was now considered treasonous by the Führer. Loyalty superseded military reality.
Meanwhile, the sudden thrust began on November 20th.
That's right. The same icy fog hampered visibility, but the massed Soviet forces just poured through the lines of the Romanian Fourth Army. The defenders were crushed. Reports describe Romanian anti-tank crews firing their pitiful 37mm guns until they were literally run over by marauding Soviet tanks.
So on Saturday, November 21st, as the two pincers are rapidly closing in, General Paulus finally realizes the scale of the disaster. He asked Berlin for permission to pull his entire army out of Stalingrad and set up a new defensive line on the Don.
And Hitler's response sealed the fate of the Sixth Army and, in many ways, the entire Eastern Front. Paulus immediately received two famous messages. First, he was ordered to, quote, form an all-round defensive position and await further orders.
And the second, more damning order.
Yeah.
The Sixth Army was henceforth designated Fortress Stalingrad. Any chance of a breakout was immediately rejected.
And that was the moment. That was a moment the strategic victory was secured. By ordering the Sixth Army to stay put, Hitler gave Zhukov and Dostoevsky the crucial time they needed to solidify the encirclement, bring up anti-tank defenses, and prepare for the long siege. He threw away their only chance to save their best field army in the east.
The trap snapped shut 2 days later. On November 23rd, Major General Volsky's 4th Mechanized Corps met Colonel Kravchenko's 4th Tank Corps at the Karpovka River. The encirclement was complete.
It was. It trapped approximately 300,000 Axis personnel, Germans, Romanians, and others inside the pocket, or the Kessel. It was just a stunning strategic success of deep mechanized operations.
So once the trap was closed, the Sixth Army's demise became this prolonged, agonizing siege.
It did. And Hitler, in an act of just profound self-deception, immediately promised that the Luftwaffe, led by Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, would supply the Encircle Army by air until relief could be organized.
But this promise was based on a prior, much smaller success at Demyansk earlier in the war. Stalingrad was a totally different logistical nightmare. And Göring was just lying to Hitler about the Luftwaffe's capacity, wasn't he?
Completely. The Sixth Army required a minimum of 700 tons of supplies, daily food, fuel, ammunition, just to remain combat effective. The Luftwaffe never even came close to that. They averaged barely 100 tons per day.
Why so little?
Well, they were relying largely on the limited-capacity Junkers Ju-52 transport aircraft. And they were facing atrocious winter flying conditions, constant fog, and a heavily contested airspace. The Soviets were throwing everything at them.
So this inability to meet the required supply led to rapid starvation, resource depletion, and a total collapse in morale.
And the situation got dramatically worse with the loss of the key airfields inside the pocket. The Soviets slowly choked off that air supply route. They captured Potomnik Airfield on January 16, 1943, and then Gumrak, the last viable airfield, on the night of January 21st.
And once those were gone, that was it for organized air supply. And crucially, for evacuating the thousands of wounded.
Right. The only option left was intermittent airdrops of ammunition and food, which were often inaccurate and totally insufficient to prevent mass starvation.
By late January, the dire consequences were clear in the communications going back to Hitler. Paulus reported 18,000 wounded without the slightest aid of bandages and medicines.
And despite that horrifying situation, Hitler ordered them to stand fast to the last soldier and the last bullet.
The final Soviet offensive, Operation Koltso, or the Ring, began on January 10, 1943.
And it opened with the largest bombardment of the war up to that point. Nearly 7,000 field guns and mortars firing against the German positions, systematically just reducing the pocket.
And yet the Soviets offered surprisingly generous surrender terms.
They did. Safety for all prisoners, medical care, permission to keep personal belongings, normal food rations, even post-war repatriation to any country they wished.
Paulus, recognizing the futility of it all, requested permission from Hitler to accept those terms.
Which Hitler instantly rejected on a point of honor. He demanded the army fight to the death. And then came the final bizarre act on January 30th, the 10th anniversary of his rise to power.
He issued a raft of field promotions to the officers in the Kessel, making Paulus a general feldmarschall, a field marshal.
And the implication was unmistakable, wasn't it? There was no record of a German or Prussian field marshal ever having surrendered. Hitler fully expected Paulus to fight to the last man and then commit suicide rather than face capture.
But Paulus chose the pragmatic route. He surrendered the southern pocket of resistance on January 31st, 1943, stating he would not shoot himself for Hitler.
General Karl Strecker, commanding the northern pocket around the tractor factory ruins, he held out for 2 more agonizing days. When he finally surrendered on February 2nd, he and his chief of staff drafted the final signal sent from Stalingrad, and they pointedly omitted the customary Heil Hitler and replaced it with a somber, "Long live Germany."
The result was total annihilation. Only 91,000 exhausted, ill, wounded, and starving prisoners were taken, including 22 generals. The combined German losses exceeded 300,000 men.
And of those 91,000 prisoners, only about 5,000 would ever return home years later. The Soviet victory here just permanently broke the German belief in its own invincibility.
The sheer scale and success of Operation Uranus, it fundamentally changed the war. But it also seems to have cemented a key element of Soviet strategy going forward.
The total mastery of Maskirovka, operational deception, it became doctrine.
What's fascinating here is this commitment to deception wasn't just for Stalingrad. It was a sustained, deep campaign against German intelligence for years afterwards. It suggests that Zhukov and Vasilevsky knew their greatest strategic advantage was exploiting Hitler's paranoia and his high command's blindness.
Oh, absolutely. And the most audacious example of this was Operation Berezino, known in English sources as Operation Shattering. This was so successful it ran from 1944 until the very end of the war in May 1945, and it was proposed by Stalin himself.
What was the goal?
To create the illusion of a large German resistance pocket deep behind Soviet lines in Belarus near the Berezina River. The goal was to deplete Nazi intelligence resources by having them constantly try to supply and rescue this fictional pocket of 2,500 men.
And how did they sell this?
Well, the NKVD Stalin's secret police, they forced a genuine German prisoner of war, a Lieutenant Colonel Heinrich Scherhorn, to collaborate and serve as the supposed commander of this encircled group. They even assigned a German communist as his full-time aide to watch him and handle the communications.
So the deception began with a carefully crafted wireless message from a Soviet agent, Max, who was actually Alexander Demyanov, reporting that Scherhorn's detachment was surrounded but desperately fighting on.
And the Germans fell for it. Repeatedly. Although counterintelligence officers at the OKH, the Army High Command, they suspected a Soviet Funkspiel, a radio game.
Reinhard Gehlen, the same head of Foreign Armies East who failed to spot the 5th Tank Army at Stalingrad, he intervened directly.
He did. And you have to ask why. Why make the same mistake twice? Was it institutional fear of contradicting Hitler, or just a genuine inability to process the depth of Soviet deception?
What do you think?
It was a mix. Gehlen had to save face after his previous failures, and this idea of a deeply embedded partisan group fighting behind enemy lines, it fit perfectly into Hitler's late war guerrilla fantasy. So Gehlen demanded full support for Scherhorn, calling it a matter of prestige. He prioritized ideology and prestige over sound military judgment, again.
So the Germans wasted vast resources on this fiction. German commandos and agents sent to assist, dropped in by air, were routinely captured by waiting in KVD agents.
Not only captured, but immediately forced to join the Funkspiel. They were forced to radio back confirmation of their safe landing and the heroic fighting spirit of Scherhorn's men, and this continued for over a year.
It's just incredible. The deception was so effective that radio contact was maintained even as late as May 1945.
And here's the ultimate, mind-boggling absurdity of German blindness and hubris. Scherhorn, the puppet commander who was actively working for the NKVD, was promoted to colonel and awarded the prestigious Knight's Cross by Hitler on March 23, 1945.
Weeks before the end of the war. A fake commander, collaborating with the enemy, being elevated to hero status by the Führer. It illustrates this profound continuity, doesn't it?
It does. The strategic blind spots, the preference for ideological wish fulfillment over verifiable intelligence that led to the catastrophe of Operation Uranus in 1942, they were persistent, institutionalized, and never truly fixed by the German command.
So what does this all mean? When you look back at Stalingrad, you realize it wasn't just a battle of courage and brutality inside the city ruins. That city fight was the necessary bloody anvil where German manpower was ground down.
But the true victory, Operation Uranus, that was a profound triumph of intelligence, of sophisticated deception, logistical superiority, and strategic foresight by commanders like Zhukov and Vasilevsky. They knew exactly where the enemy, specifically those poorly equipped Romanian flanks, was most vulnerable.
And they had the strategic patience and the massive reserves provided by that command-driven economy to strike deep around the city, not at it.
Exactly. And the methods developed during Uranus, focusing on these large-scale mechanized deep operations where shock armies were deployed to cause systemic collapse rather than localized attrition, those were precisely the methods the Soviets honed and used throughout the rest of the war to crush the German military machine.
So the confidence the Soviet command gained in these massive mechanized operations, coupled with their expertise in sophisticated deception, that provided the roadmap for the destruction of the austere.
That's right. The Battle of Stalingrad was less about individual heroics and much more about the Soviet command learning how to think bigger, deeper, and faster than Hitler's ideological staff ever could.
And as we close out this deep dive, consider this final provocative thought. While the battle itself took place in the ruins on the Volga, the industrial heart of the Soviet war effort had been rapidly evacuated by the NKPS. Over 1,500 factories were uprooted and moved, particularly to the Urals, to places like Chelyabinsk, which became known as Tankograd.
Hmm.
And this effort, it depended heavily on the mass mobilization of mothers and daughters, who were often working 16-hour shifts in unheated, windowless factories, systematically outproducing the Reich in modern armor.
The immense silent productivity of that Soviet wartime economy, coupled with the organizational skill of the Soviet railway system, meant the Soviets could generate and transport more modern tanks and more men than the Germans ever believed possible.
So was the Battle of Stalingrad won not just on the Volga, but ultimately in the harsh industrial heartland of the Urals, where that silent army of laborers made Operation Uranus possible? Something for you to mull over.